sites in Young's Bay, which you can see closer to the mouth of the river, the whole bunch of circles. That's from my dissertation research from 2017. The main thing I want to point out here is that the amount of native cover on reference sites, so these are our sort of target sites, really varies throughout the Lower Columbia River. Sort of very, minimal amount of non-native or reed canary grass cover at the mouth of the river, Young's Bay, the Waco Slough, and then as you move closer to Sauvie Island, you sort of get a maximum amount of non-native cover and reed canary grass. And then as you get towards sort of like Franz Lake area, the cover goes back up and it's more native. And this has been really well established by PNNL. They've done a couple different papers talking about the distribution of native and non-native plant communities throughout the estuary, especially that increase in reed canary grass as you move upriver. And so this is something that's pretty well established in the literature. And so some other things that we have learned over the years about reed canary grass is that it affects habitat complexity and diversity. It impacts detritus quality and nutrient cycling on sites. It impacts macroinvertebrate communities and food webs. And also there's some links to cell-mounted growth. It negatively impacting cell-mounted growth. So there's a lot of research locally and outside of the area that's sort of pointing to this. And so this really is important because, why are we trying to manage reed canary grass? Well, these are all of those reasons. And so I'm going to jump in a little bit into the details of these. And so something that we've seen in our reference sites through the ecosystem monitoring program, first I'm going to point out here, this is a graph with native plant cover on the y-axis and reed canary grass cover on the x. And this is the annual mean cover along the EMP sites from Welch Island to Franz Lake. And what we find is a really strong relationship between reed canary grass cover and native plant cover. Increases in reed canary grass cover resulting in reduction of native plant cover. Again, this is something we know, we talk about it, but this is really showing you the data. This is something that we see across all the sites, and essentially reed canary grass is growing at the exclusion of natives. Now looking at this a little differently, including restoration sites, this is not just reed canary grass cover, this is non-native cover, but this non-native cover is really driven by reed canary grass. This is out of the SM2 report. What we see here is native species richness versus non-native cover. And again, a fairly strong relationship across all sites and all years of restoration and reference sites with an increase in non-native abundance, reducing native species richness. So this really gets at that impacting habitat complexity and diversity. And so some other studies, and this is not an exhaustive list, but this is just some things I wanted to highlight. Studies showing reed canary grass impacts in the Lower Columbia River. The Estuary Partnership led a reed canary grass study in 2014 and 2015. One of the key findings out of that study, it was comparing reed canary grass and Carex lindii plant communities, was that reed canary grass potentially supports different macroinvertebrate compositions than native plant communities, and that this may impact macroinvertebrates. That wasn't, also decomposition potential. So reed canary grass and natives may have different decomposition potentials as well as support different macroinvertebrate communities. Now this was, NOAA did a study in 2016 that had more conclusive results, essentially finding very similar things. So slightly different macroinvertebrate compositions in the native emergent vegetation versus the reed canary grass, with cell-mounted growth being greater in the native emergent vegetation. So again, supporting that. And then I did my dissertation research at PSU in 2017. I did a seed bank study looking at restoration and reference site seed banks. I found that reed canary grass was a very prolific seed producer. Its seeds were distributed much more abundantly than native seeds across the high to low marsh gradient, both in the reference site and the restoration site. So those seeds are everywhere. However, the hydrology, daily flooding, and soil salinity really impacted. This was an experiment I did in the greenhouse, germination. So, how we're restoring these conditions may really help us reduce reed canary grass. And then this last year through the ecosystem monitoring program, we took a really close look at the lignin and carbon and nitrogen content of reed canary grass compared to natives. We found that it did have greater lignin and carbon content, meaning that it's going to be decomposing differently than native species and really impacting the macrodetritus food web dynamics. We're going to continue to monitor that as we move forward with the ecosystem monitoring program. So these are all sort of diving into those details. Where did I get those assumptions from? And so when we think about restoration approaches and how we are going to restore native plant communities on these sites, a lot of the times we're thinking about hydrologic reconnection, topographic changes and topographic complexity, and utilizing scrape down to impact tree canary grass and native plant communities. So these actions are really looking at what we're trying to affect are these drivers of recovery, which is hydrology, impacting the hydrology on the site, daily flooding, seasonal flooding. We're impacting the soil conditions through both reintroducing hydrology and doing scrape downs. And we're also impacting the native and non-native seed bank locally, and then opening it up to seed bank sources outside of the site. And so if we think about this as internal and external drivers of recovery, the hydrology, internal drivers, things that we can control essentially through restoration, are that hydrologic connectivity. You know, how well are we restoring the full tidal prism, daily flooding conditions, and then the extent of the hydrologic gradient. You know, are we creating a new slope, a new area of inundation? You know, how steep is that? Are we just restoring low marsh or restoring high marsh? And then external forces that are really also important that we are really outside of our control as restoration practitioners are seasonal water year conditions, the freshet conditions. And so to illustrate that, I want to show this graph that is in the EMP report this year. We have reed canary grass cover on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis we have the cumulative river discharge at Bonneville from May to August, so that's the growing season. And what you see here is depending on the annual freshet conditions, so the magnitude of the freshet, you really do see a variability in the reed canary grass cover. And so what this indicates, and this is mainly for essentially going from Sauvie Island upriver. And what we see is that reed canary grass has a natural variability up to 20% shift in reed canary grass cover on an annual basis, pretty much being driven by freshet conditions. And so that's really important when we're thinking about how restoration outcomes, how we're interpreting those, because water year is going to really matter. And so then we look at other drivers of recovery. So soil conditions, thinking about the degree of hydrologic connectivity. How are we reconnecting the hydrology? What does that reconnected hydrology look like? That's really going to alter those soil conditions. That's pretty much the primary driver of essentially killing off non-native field species and allowing natives to germinate and grow. And then if we're using scrape down, that can affect those soil conditions further by lowering soil organic matter, lowering nutrient retention, increasing bulk density through compacting equipment, and then we're just removing the seed bank, which is sort of the point in some ways, because we want to get rid of the reed canary grass, but we're also removing any natives. So then we become really dependent on what our local seed source is. And so that's kind of an external driver in terms of, you don't necessarily control what's nearby and what's going to be germinating on your site. So these are all really important things to think about when you're thinking about the recovery of native plant communities on a site. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the very specific results I got from my dissertation research, where I looked at soil conditions, hydrologic conditions, and plant community conditions across a suite of sites ranging in age from 1 year to 54 years post-restoration. Youngs Bay is a little bit special because it's a oglahaline. It means it's just a little bit salty, so it's not necessarily as fresh as some of these mid and upriver sites, but it also, I think that the results are very useful. And so essentially what you see here is that along the hydrologic gradient, we have the high to low marsh. What I found was that there was essentially a threshold where there was no recovery in plant community, even 54 years post-restoration. And these soil conditions were really similar to the site pre-restoration or a pasture site. And so essentially there's a threshold where the hydrologic reconnectivity is not kind of pushing those soil conditions into reference zone, if that makes sense. And so these are the last slides I'm going to show, and I just literally made these 1 second ago. And so what I want to show here is that hydrologic threshold, I think we can kind of even see these in terms of looking at reed canary grass cover in reference sites. So this is Cunningham Lake, and you have mean plant cover on the y-axis, and on the x-axis you have mean percent time inundated in August. And this is an average over 2005 to 2017. And what you see here is for this site, between essentially 35 and 30% of the day, That's like an inundation threshold, where if you get greater than that, if you're inundated greater than that on a daily basis, on average in August, and August is chosen because if you think about the freshet and how that affects sites on Sauvie Island, if you have the freshet continue into August, it's likely that most of the growing season has been inundated. So this is really similar to looking at some exceedance value, but it's really slicing it just a little bit differently to make it a little bit more approachable instead of thinking about it on a daily basis. How much of the day is that site flooded? So on average for the month of August, if it's flooded less than 30% of the time, you're going to probably get dominance by reed canary grass on that site. So instead of thinking about elevations, you should think about the hydrology on your site specifically, because that's really one of the primary drivers. And now if we move a little bit upriver and we look at Welch Island, I apologize for the axes are the same, but the numbers look a little funny here just because I didn't get a chance to final format it. We don't have an abundance or a dominance of reed canary grass on this site, and I should highlight here that far is wrong. So if you look at that dotted line, that should be Carex lindbii, so that's dominating on the site. And then the yellow line is reed canary grass, and then the other light green line is wapato. And so what you see here is similar. There's a hydrologic threshold, again, daily inundation in August, that you see a switch between wapato and reed canary grass. So even though it's a much lower abundance of reed canary grass, you still see that threshold, that hydrologic threshold. And I think that using this sort of hydrologic information and trying to model that on our restoration sites can be really meaningful for trying to control reed canary grass abundance. And so now Matt's going to take over and talk about conclusions. That's what we talked about.
Yes, this is. But you were doing such a good job. What are we talking about? Okay, so we're talking about we have our established wetland hydrologic zones that came out of the PNNL work, and within those, they sort of outline the different elevations at which where they've seen different types of communities. And so, taking that information and coupling it with the inundation information, you can begin to do you can do very basic hydro modeling to predict inundation. So sometimes it's just a hypsometric curve. Sometimes you can do more in-depth modeling if you want to. If you really are trying to nail what kind of plant communities you're going to potentially see on site. So in relation to soil scrape down, keeping in mind that removing soil organic matter, compacting the soil, really influences how quickly native plants are going to return to the area. So a lot of sites we've been to where there's been extensive soil scrape down, it's taken at least a minimum of 3 to 5 years before we even see the establishment. I should say the sustained establishment of native vegetation. Part of that is just you need the soil to sort of recover from the removal, essentially all the topsoil. A lot of times you're just removing all the topsoil. So it might be good to think about that when you're evaluating and adjusting your expectations for how fast native plant communities are going to return to a site post-restoration. And again, seed banks, as Sarah mentioned, the seed bank can both be on-site and be coming off-site. So if you do remove your on-site seed bank and you're not putting down some type of seed of a species you hope to see, then you're sort of leaving it up to the whim of the outside hydrology to sort of reintroduce what kind of plants you're going to get on site. Although, at some sites we have seen without seeding the return of some native species just buried, and I think Tom will probably talk about that a little bit. And then, we've really been focusing on creating goals and sort of what are reasonable goals for different sites within the river, because not all sites are going to return to this pristine reference condition due to the limits of the drivers on the site, so be it hydrology or elevation. And so what are reasonable goals to set for sites depending on where you are in the river? And so, through the monitoring we've done, we've been able to sort of chip away at what restored would look like at different parts of the river based on the data we've collected. And I think that's all we have for today. So hopefully that'll lay the groundwork for everything you guys are going to see coming up. So if you have any questions, please feel free.
I guess I have a question about the influence of removing soil organic matter. That wasn't exactly clear to me. Does that favor natives or does it favor retailers?
It's not going to favor. It's going to favor bare grounds. Because what happens is that hydrology is critical. So let's say you have the hydrology really dialed in for like Wapato or Carricks, but you've done a scrape down and you removed all the topsoil and all the organic matter. So if the soil can't retain nutrients, doesn't have any organic matter to retain nutrients, you're going to have a much slower recovery. And so when Matt was saying, oh, it takes 5 years to see plants established, we're talking about like a 1% cover of Wapato. So we're still getting a lot of bare ground, and that's because it could take 50 years for the organic matter to redevelop on that site to be able to retain enough nutrients to support plant communities. So that's sort of where I'm going with that. And there's been work, I don't have the citations off the top of my head, but I know up in Washington, and maybe you're familiar with some of it, maybe it's some of your work actually, Ron, that where you guys have studied some scrape down areas and it's just shown that it takes a really long time to recover depending on just local conditions. And exactly what, maybe you scrape down and you're scraping down and the soil that you get to isn't, a solid clay. Maybe it has organic matter in it. That's going to be variable. So it's something you just need to think about. So it just depends on the degree of scrape down and what that soil looks like. Does that make sense? Okay.
What's the mechanism, or what's the physiological response to more water? Is it in?
You want to do it?
Huh?
Soil oxygen reduction
Okay.
potential
Yeah.
is a trigger for seed germination.
Seed germination. Okay.
So when you increase hydrology, you're going to, we all know, we are all, wetland 101, obligate plants require certain conditions to grow. And essentially they are better at growing under more stressful, oxygen-reduced conditions than facultative wet, like Greek canary grass, and other species that are more upland species. And so that, from what I understand and from the research that I've done, one good indicator of that is soil oxygen reduction potential. And so that's essentially how much oxygen is in the soil. And so if you have frequent flooding or seasonal, long-term seasonal flooding, that's going to shift that soil ORP and essentially promote native obligates, or maybe non-native obligates, depending on, that's not a problem that we particularly have, but just obligate plants in general.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sarah, what did you, looking at August window specifically, what we found, and I'll touch more on this when I speak about it, is we actually were looking at having water control, or having the hydrology way earlier than May, really looking at it February, March, because the Reed canary grass starts to germinate before a lot of these other plants. And so really trying to key in on the hydrology really early season, if you will. I know you said you chose August because that gets you the whole growing season, if you will, but I'm just kind of curious why the focus on that and not earlier in the season.
A couple reasons. One was, like I said, so the assumption going with using August, the assumption is that you are picking up on if the water is high on the site, and if we're talking about like Sauvie Island up to Franz Lake, right? Because they're more fluvial driven as you go. The other sites are just more consistent year round, less influenced by the depression. So if you're talking about those sites, those upriver sites, the assumption going in is if you have high water in August, you've had high water through the whole growing season. And so I just snipped the data to August as a way to try to look at that. And then that was a little bit opportunistic of me because for the ecosystem monitoring program, for whatever reason, we have a lot of really consistent data for the month of August, but not necessarily the whole growing season. And so I'm going to continue to massage that and think about that more critically, but I think that understanding that, Reed canary grass is an early grower, but if you have really high water for a couple of months because of the freshet, it's gonna beat it back. So, I mean, where are you specifically looking at that?
For Sauvie Island.
Okay, yeah. So it's probably talking about similar things.
Yeah, no, we're absolutely talking about the similar things, and I'm just trying to understand the analysis because I agree with everything that you're saying. Just why you chose that end of it versus early in the season, because that's really been our focus, is trying to get the elevations, which ties into the hydrology, early in the season to try to suppress it / drown it.
And so if you have that data, that's it's not a bad way to look at it. And I would argue, or I would posit or hypothesize that we could probably regress the amount of time that that's inundated for the whole growing season versus the amount of time it's done in August, just because I feel like there's that correlation there. That makes sense. So I'm trying to represent that,
Yeah.
I just don't have that data.
So to me, that's an interesting question because I know it's the work on the metro speculation. That was one of their drivers was when they close those gates in order to have it flooded. And that's when it affects access by fish. So if you could pin down what that critical time frame is, even if you can't remove water control structures, you might still make sites better. So, you know, the best thing would be to just get rid of them, but there are places where that's not going to happen, and it may be that they could be managed better.
And close it off earlier and then open it.
Yeah, depending, or vice versa. The real question, I mean, you can get fish using it over the winter, at least coho using it over the winter and into spring. Later in the season, it's going to be too hot anyway for those fish. So it's kind of that, if you can nibble on either end and dial in the time period, then you can have at least some temporal effect.
I know that Elaine Stewart, Alan Yakeley, and Noah Jenkins have done some work at Smoky Lakes doing that same thing where they're trying to manage the reef canary grass with the water control structures but still allow fish access. So that would be something to Google. I didn't talk about that in my presentation, but that's something that they did. And they did flip it to polygonal instead of reef canary grass. But again, with those water control structures, limited fish
I just
use.
want to rip them out. So.
Yeah, and to me, that's one thing that's nice about the scrape down idea, that we will avoid the problem altogether.
Water infrastructure.
But that is a central tenet of the West Soil Management, basically, is get it started in February, March with water, and then you control it. I mean, generally, that's what they would say, almost all about this one.
Did you correlate the marsh elevations to that crossover point with inundation curve?
Yes.
And do they match? I'm just curious.
We found that, we did it real quick with Cunningham Lake right before we came, and we found that the elevation of like 2.6 meters is that threshold, and it lined up perfectly with the inundation.
Yeah.
For that part of the river?
Yeah, for that one site. We didn't do it for all the sites.
Yeah, we essentially looked at the PNNL paper from the Restoration Design Challenges, and there's a table in there showing the lower extent of reed canary grass. And so we had done our whole analysis, and then we took that number and converted it from feet to meters, and it almost exactly matched. So.
I would say one more thing about the August thing, because I'm still working with that in myself, is that depending on where you're at, August is going to be more important. Like Franz Lake is actually really critical for August because it is typically inundated longer because it's so close to Bonneville. And so what we found is that if Franz Lake is inundated, if it has water in August, then you're going to have a much more Wapato than if it doesn't have any water. And that's, again, that just has to do with that fluvial-driven condition there. So it just really depends on where you're at in the river. And we should all work more on that because I think it's really interesting. That's all I'll say.
Any more questions before we go to the next? Okay. Gary is, well, Ian queues up. Gary is operating the recording from his office. So he's stopping and then starting.
The